In the cold marble halls of Renaissance Florence, where power shifted like shadows cast by flickering candlelight, Niccolò Machiavelli penned observations that would echo through 5 centuries of human governance. His words, born from the brutal realities of Italian city-states locked in perpetual struggle, carried a warning that modern leaders still fail to heed. The gentle ruler who seeks universal approval destroys himself more thoroughly than any external enemy ever could. The year was 1513, and Machiavelli sat in exile, his political career shattered by the return of the Medici family to power. Yet from this position of enforced reflection, he crafted insights that penetrated to the very heart of human nature and the exercise of authority. His central thesis, that excessive agreeableness corrodes the foundations of leadership, emerged not from abstract philosophy but from witnessing the rise and fall of princes who confused kindness with weakness, and popularity with effectiveness. This document explores the profound implications of Machiavelli's warning across 3 interconnected dimensions. First, we examine how the psychology of excessive agreeableness creates fundamental vulnerabilities in leadership, transforming would-be authorities into prisoners of others' expectations. Second, we trace the historical patterns that demonstrate how agreeable leaders systematically undermine their own power structures, creating the very instabilities that lead to their downfall. Finally, we investigate the paradoxical path of self-destruction as a form of self-preservation, how the conscious dismantling of one's weak, approval-seeking self creates an unassailable core of authentic authority. The agreeable leader presents himself as a contradiction wrapped in good intentions. He desires to be loved by all, to offend none, to find compromise where conflict seems inevitable. These impulses, while admirable in personal relationships, become pathological when transplanted into the realm of governance and organizational leadership. Machiavelli understood that authority requires the capacity for decisive action, even when such action generates opposition or resentment. The leader who cannot bear to disappoint anyone will inevitably disappoint everyone. Consider the psychological architecture of excessive agreeableness. At its foundation lies a profound insecurity, a desperate need for external validation that transforms every decision into a referendum on one's worthiness. The agreeable leader does not ask what action will best serve my objectives and my people, but rather what choice will maintain the greatest number of positive relationships. This fundamental inversion of priorities creates a cascade of weaknesses that shrewd opponents learn to exploit with devastating effectiveness. The agreeable leader becomes predictable in his very unpredictability. His opponents know that he will always seek the path of least resistance, always choose compromise over confrontation, always prefer the appearance of harmony to the reality of effective action. This knowledge becomes a weapon in the hands of those who understand that true power often requires the willingness to be temporarily unpopular in service of longer-term objectives. Machiavelli observed this pattern repeatedly among the rulers of his time. Those who sought universal approval found themselves manipulated by factions who understood their psychological weaknesses. A prince who could not bear to refuse any request soon found his treasury empty and his authority diluted among countless competing interests. A leader who promised everything to everyone delivered nothing to anyone who truly mattered. The modern corporate world provides countless examples of this dynamic. The CEO who seeks to please all stakeholders, shareholders, employees, customers, regulators, media, often finds himself paralyzed by the impossibility of his task. Each constituency demands different and, often contradictory actions. The agreeable executive attempts to craft solutions that somehow satisfy everyone, producing lukewarm compromises that inspire no one and solve nothing. Meanwhile, his more decisive competitors seize market opportunities and build stronger organizations by making clear choices about whom they serve and how they will serve them. This pattern extends beyond individual psychology to the structural dynamics of organizations and governments. Agreeable leaders tend to create agreeable institutions, bureaucracies designed to minimize conflict rather than maximize effectiveness. These systems become baroque in their complexity, as each new rule or procedure represents an attempt to avoid offending some constituency or stakeholder group. The result is institutional sclerosis, where the organization becomes increasingly incapable of rapid adaptation or decisive action. The pathology of institutional agreeableness manifests in several characteristic symptoms. Decision-making processes become elongated and inclusive to the point of paralysis. Clear lines of authority blur as leaders attempt to share responsibility and avoid the appearance of autocratic behavior. Performance standards decline as managers avoid the discomfort of delivering hard truths or making difficult personnel decisions. Innovation stagnates because new ideas inevitably threaten existing stakeholders and comfortable arrangements. Machiavelli's prince understood that effective governance sometimes required actions that would be temporarily unpopular or seemingly harsh. The leader who could not stomach such decisions would find his realm weakened by internal divisions and external threats. The modern parallel exists in leaders who cannot make necessary but painful organizational changes, who cannot terminate underperforming employees, who cannot say no to requests that would dilute focus and resources. The psychology of excessive agreeableness also creates what might be termed authority diffusion syndrome. The agreeable leader, seeking to avoid the appearance of arbitrary power, distributes decision-making authority across numerous committees, advisors, and stakeholders. While this approach may feel more democratic and inclusive, it systematically undermines the leader's ability to respond quickly to changing circumstances. When everyone is responsible for decisions, no one is truly accountable for results. This diffusion of authority creates opportunities for subordinates and rivals to accumulate power at the leader's expense. Machiavelli noted how courtiers and ministers could gradually assume the functions of weak princes, eventually making the nominal leader irrelevant to the actual governance of his realm. The modern equivalent appears in organizations where strong-willed executives gradually assume responsibilities that should belong to an indecisive CEO, or where government bureaucrats effectively control policy while elected officials focus on public relations and consensus building. The agreeable leader also falls victim to what psychologists now recognize as the fundamental attribution error in reverse. While most people tend to attribute their failures to external circumstances and their successes to personal merit, the excessively agreeable leader does the opposite. He assumes responsibility for every failure and distributes credit for every success. This psychological pattern, while admirable from a moral standpoint, systematically undermines his authority and credibility. When problems arise, as they inevitably do in any complex organization, the agreeable leader's instinct is to absorb blame and shield subordinates from criticism. When successes occur, he emphasizes the contributions of his team and minimizes his own role. Over time, this pattern creates a perception that the leader adds little value while being responsible for most problems. His supporters begin to question his competence, while his opponents see him as an easy target for criticism and manipulation. The historical record provides numerous examples of leaders whose excessive agreeableness led to their downfall. Consider the case of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, whose genuine desire to avoid conflict and please various factions within his empire contributed to the revolutionary upheaval that cost him his throne and his life. His inability to take decisive action during critical moments, his tendency to vacillate between different advisors and approaches, created a power vacuum that more ruthless and focused revolutionary forces eventually filled. Similarly, the final years of the Roman Republic witnessed the rise of leaders like Pompey the Great, whose political success depended on maintaining popularity with diverse and often contradictory constituencies. His inability to choose sides decisively during the growing conflict between traditional republican institutions and Caesar's populist movement ultimately led to his defeat and death. Caesar, by contrast, understood that effective leadership sometimes required making enemies and accepted the hatred of the optimates as the price of achieving his political objectives. The French Revolution provides another instructive example in the figure of Louis XVI. His genuine desire to reform France's financial and social problems was undermined by his inability to confront the entrenched interests that benefited from the existing system. His attempts to find compromise solutions that would satisfy both the privileged orders and the emerging Third Estate pleased no one and convinced many that he was weak and indecisive. The more extreme revolutionary forces that eventually seized power had no such scruples about offending or destroying their enemies. In the modern business world, the phenomenon of agreeable leadership failure appears regularly in the form of CEOs who lose their positions not because of scandal or obvious incompetence, but because of an inability to make hard choices and implement necessary changes. These leaders often preside over gradual declines rather than dramatic failures. Their companies slowly lose market position as more decisive competitors capture opportunities and respond more quickly to changing conditions. The technology industry provides particularly clear examples of this dynamic. Consider the contrast between leaders like Steve Jobs, who was notorious for his demanding standards and willingness to reject ideas and proposals that didn't meet his vision, and those who attempted to manage by consensus and avoid conflict. Jobs understood that innovation required the ability to say no to most ideas in order to focus resources on the few that could create breakthrough products. Leaders who tried to pursue every possible opportunity and please every stakeholder group typically produced mediocre results. The second dimension of Machiavelli's warning concerns the systematic way that agreeable leaders undermine the very power structures that sustain their authority. This process unfolds gradually and, often invisibly, as the leader's attempts to be fair and inclusive slowly erode the mechanisms that enable effective governance. The agreeable leader, in seeking to avoid the appearance of autocracy, creates conditions that ultimately make effective leadership impossible. The erosion begins with the leader's relationship to established protocols and hierarchies. Viewing these structures as potentially unfair or exclusionary, the agreeable leader seeks to flatten hierarchies and make decision-making processes more inclusive and democratic. While these impulses are well-intentioned, they often fail to account for the functional purposes that hierarchies serve in complex organizations. Hierarchies exist not merely to aggrandize those at the top, but to enable rapid information processing and decisive action. When a crisis emerges, organizations need clear lines of authority and responsibility that allow for quick responses. The leader who has systematically dismantled these structures in pursuit of egalitarian ideals often finds himself unable to respond effectively when speed and decisiveness become critical. The agreeable leader also tends to undermine the symbolic and ceremonial aspects of authority that reinforce his position. Viewing such displays as antiquated or elitist, he adopts more casual and approachable styles of leadership. While this approach may initially increase his popularity, it gradually erodes the psychological distance that enables others to see him as an authority figure deserving of deference and respect. Machiavelli understood that authority rested not merely on legal or institutional foundations, but on psychological and symbolic ones as well. The prince who appeared too familiar or accessible risked being seen as just another participant in political struggles rather than as the ultimate arbiter standing above such conflicts. Modern leaders who pride themselves on being just one of the team often discover that their subordinates begin treating them as peers rather than authorities, making decisive leadership increasingly difficult. This dynamic extends to the leader's willingness to make exceptions to rules and policies in individual cases. The agreeable leader, faced with requests for special consideration, often finds it difficult to maintain consistent standards. Each exception, while justifiable in isolation, contributes to a gradual erosion of the rule of law within the organization. When rules become suggestions that are frequently waived for compelling individual circumstances, the entire system of organizational governance loses credibility and effectiveness. The pattern accelerates when subordinates recognize the leader's reluctance to enforce consequences for poor performance or rule violations. The agreeable leader, seeking to avoid conflict and preserve relationships, often responds to problems with additional training, counseling, or opportunities for improvement rather than decisive disciplinary action. While such responses may be appropriate in some cases, their consistent application sends a message that standards are optional and that persistence in making requests for leniency will eventually be rewarded. Over time, this pattern creates what organizational psychologists term a culture of impunity, where individuals learn that they can violate rules and expectations without facing serious consequences. The most conscientious employees become demoralized as they see their extra efforts unrewarded and their colleagues' poor performance tolerated. Meanwhile, the least scrupulous individuals learn to exploit the leader's reluctance to enforce standards, gradually pushing boundaries until the entire organization's culture degrades. The agreeable leader's desire to be seen as fair and reasonable also leads to systematic problems with resource allocation and strategic focus. When every department's budget requests are viewed as equally valid, when every proposed initiative receives some level of support to avoid disappointing its advocates, the organization's resources become scattered across too many priorities. The result is mediocre performance across all areas rather than excellence in the few that matter most. This diffusion of focus particularly damages organizations facing competitive pressures or resource constraints. While the agreeable leader attempts to maintain funding and support for all existing programs and initiatives, more decisive competitors concentrate their efforts on the opportunities with the greatest potential for success. The agreeable leader's organization gradually loses ground not through any single dramatic failure, but through the accumulated disadvantage of divided attention and resources. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing as the organization's declining performance creates pressure for even more inclusive decision-making processes and stakeholder consultation. The agreeable leader, interpreting poor results as evidence that he hasn't been sufficiently collaborative, responds by creating additional committees, advisory groups, and feedback mechanisms. These structures further slow decision-making and dilute accountability, creating a vicious cycle of declining effectiveness and increased procedural complexity. The phenomenon extends to the leader's relationship with external stakeholders and competitors. The agreeable leader often assumes that his commitment to fairness and inclusion will be reciprocated by others. He expects that his willingness to compromise and seek win-win solutions will inspire similar behavior from those with whom he negotiates and competes. This assumption frequently proves naive, as more Machiavellian opponents recognize the agreeable leader's psychological vulnerabilities and exploit them systematically. In international relations, this dynamic appears in the form of leaders who consistently offer concessions in hopes of building goodwill and trust, only to find that their generosity is interpreted as weakness and invites increasingly aggressive demands. The agreeable leader's desire to be seen as reasonable and peace-loving becomes a strategic disadvantage when dealing with opponents who view negotiations as zero-sum competitions rather than opportunities for mutual benefit. The domestic political realm provides similar examples. Politicians who pride themselves on their ability to work across party lines and find bipartisan solutions often discover that their willingness to compromise is exploited by more partisan opponents. These politicians find themselves consistently making concessions without receiving equivalent concessions in return, gradually undermining their effectiveness and disappointing their own supporters. The business world offers countless parallel examples. Companies led by executives who prioritize stakeholder harmony and consensus building often find themselves outmaneuvered by competitors who are willing to make hard choices about market positioning, resource allocation, and strategic partnerships. The agreeable executive's desire to maintain positive relationships with all stakeholders, suppliers, customers, employees, shareholders, regulators often results in strategies that satisfy no one completely and create vulnerabilities that more focused competitors can exploit. The technology industry provides particularly stark examples of this dynamic. Companies that attempt to serve every possible market segment and please every possible customer group often find themselves surpassed by more focused competitors who clearly define their target markets and optimize their products and services accordingly. The agreeable approach of trying to be everything to everyone typically results in products that are mediocre across all dimensions rather than excellent in the areas that matter most to specific customer segments. The financial services industry demonstrates similar patterns. Banks and investment firms led by executives who seek to balance the competing demands of shareholders, regulators, employees, and customers often find themselves constrained by complex compliance and governance structures that slow decision-making and reduce competitiveness. Meanwhile, more agile competitors with clearer strategic focus and greater willingness to accept regulatory or stakeholder criticism often capture market opportunities more quickly and effectively. The third and most paradoxical dimension of Machiavelli's warning involves the process by which leaders can immunize themselves against external threats by destroying their own weak, approval-seeking selves. This concept challenges conventional wisdom about leadership development and personal growth, suggesting that strength comes not from building upon existing characteristics but from ruthlessly eliminating those that create vulnerability. The process begins with a brutal self-assessment that most people find psychologically difficult to undertake. The leader must honestly examine his motivations and decision-making patterns to identify the extent to which they are driven by a need for approval rather than by rational analysis of objectives and constraints. This examination requires confronting uncomfortable truths about one's own psychology and the ways in which the desire to be liked has compromised one's effectiveness. Machiavelli's insight was that external enemies can only destroy what is already weak within us. The leader whose authority depends on universal approval has created a fundamental vulnerability that opponents can exploit by turning stakeholder groups against each other and forcing choices that will inevitably disappoint some constituencies. By contrast, the leader who has eliminated his psychological dependence on approval becomes immune to such manipulation because he no longer fears the loss of popularity that his enemies seek to inflict. This transformation requires developing what might be termed strategic indifference, the ability to remain emotionally detached from others' opinions while maintaining intellectual clarity about their importance for achieving specific objectives. The leader learns to distinguish between relationships that are instrumentally valuable for accomplishing goals and those that merely satisfy psychological needs for acceptance and validation. The process involves systematically identifying and eliminating behaviors, commitments, and relationships that exist primarily to maintain the appearance of being agreeable rather than to serve legitimate strategic purposes. This might involve ending ineffective programs that continue only because discontinuing them would disappoint their advocates. It might require terminating employees whose poor performance has been tolerated because of personal relationships or concerns about their reactions to criticism. The psychological challenge of this transformation cannot be underestimated. Most people develop their agreeable tendencies as adaptive strategies for navigating complex social environments. The behaviors that create vulnerability in leadership positions often serve protective functions earlier in life or in different contexts. Eliminating these patterns requires not only intellectual understanding but also emotional courage and sustained practice in acting contrary to deeply ingrained instincts. The leader undergoing this transformation often experiences a period of discomfort as he learns to tolerate the disapproval and criticism that inevitably accompany decisive action. Former allies may express disappointment or anger when they discover that their access and influence have been reduced. Stakeholder groups that previously enjoyed special consideration may respond with hostility when treated according to consistent standards rather than individual relationships. However, this period of adjustment typically gives way to increased effectiveness and, paradoxically, greater respect from both supporters and opponents. People may not always like the decisions made by a leader who has eliminated his approval-seeking tendencies, but they can predict and rely upon his behavior in ways that were impossible when his actions were driven by a desire to please everyone. The transformation also creates opportunities for building more authentic and functionally valuable relationships. When the leader no longer needs approval from everyone, he can develop deeper and more honest connections with those whose opinions genuinely matter for achieving his objectives. These relationships, based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than on the leader's psychological neediness, tend to be more durable and productive than those maintained purely for the sake of being liked. The process of eliminating approval-seeking behavior often reveals the extent to which such behaviors had been consuming mental and emotional energy that could be better directed toward strategic thinking and effective action. Leaders who complete this transformation frequently report feeling more focused and energetic, as they no longer expend psychological resources on managing others' opinions and maintaining relationships that serve no substantive purpose. The strategic advantages of this transformation extend beyond improved decision-making to enhanced negotiating effectiveness and competitive positioning. Opponents who previously relied on exploiting the leader's psychological vulnerabilities find that their traditional tactics no longer work. The leader who no longer fears disapproval or criticism becomes much more difficult to manipulate through threats to his reputation or relationships. This immunity to manipulation becomes particularly valuable in high-stakes negotiations where opponents attempt to use emotional pressure and relationship dynamics to extract concessions. The leader who has eliminated his approval-seeking tendencies can focus purely on the substantive merits of different options without being distracted by concerns about how his choices will affect others' opinions of him. The transformation also enables more effective delegation and organizational design. Leaders who no longer need to be personally involved in every decision to maintain relationships and approval can create more autonomous and accountable organizational structures. They can establish clear performance standards and consequences without worrying about whether such systems will make them less popular with subordinates. The historical record provides examples of leaders who successfully completed this transformation and thereby strengthened their positions against external threats. Winston Churchill's political career illustrates this pattern clearly. Early in his career, Churchill was often criticized for changing party affiliations and positions based on political calculations and the desire to maintain his career prospects. However, by the time he assumed leadership during World War II, he had developed a willingness to make deeply unpopular decisions when he believed them necessary for Britain's survival. Churchill's refusal to consider peace negotiations with Nazi Germany, despite pressure from within his own cabinet and widespread public war weariness, exemplified the kind of strategic indifference to approval that Machiavelli advocated. His critics could not destroy him through the traditional methods of political manipulation because he had already accepted the possibility of losing popularity and position if such losses were necessary to achieve his fundamental objectives. Similarly, Charles de Gaulle's leadership during and after World War II demonstrated the power of eliminating approval-seeking behavior. His decision to continue resistance from London despite the opposition of many French political leaders, his willingness to antagonize Allied leaders when he believed French interests were at stake, and his later decisions regarding Algerian independence all reflected a psychological independence from others' opinions that made him extremely difficult for opponents to manipulate or control. The business world provides contemporary examples of this transformation in leaders who have built successful organizations by maintaining clear strategic focus despite criticism and pressure from various stakeholder groups. Warren Buffett's investment philosophy exemplifies this approach. His willingness to be criticized for missing technology opportunities, for maintaining too much cash during bull markets, or for refusing to split Berkshire Hathaway stock reflects a deep indifference to popular opinion that has enabled him to maintain consistent long-term strategies despite short-term criticism. Jeff Bezos's leadership of Amazon demonstrated similar patterns. His willingness to accept years of criticism for the company's lack of profitability, his decisions to enter businesses that cannibalized existing Amazon operations, and his focus on long-term value creation despite quarterly earnings pressures all reflected a psychological independence that made him immune to the kind of stakeholder pressure that constrains more approval-seeking executives. The transformation process involves several distinct phases that leaders typically experience as they eliminate their approval-seeking tendencies. The first phase involves recognition, developing honest awareness of the extent to which the desire for approval influences decision-making and behavior. This recognition often comes through feedback from trusted advisors, analysis of past decisions that were compromised by political considerations, or observation of more effective leaders who demonstrate different approaches. The second phase involves experimentation, deliberately making decisions based on substantive analysis rather than relationship considerations, even when such decisions create disapproval or criticism. This phase requires conscious practice in tolerating the discomfort that accompanies disappointing others and learning to evaluate the actual consequences of such disappointment rather than the anticipated emotional reactions. The third phase involves integration, developing new habits and instinctive responses that prioritize effectiveness over approval. During this phase, the leader begins to experience the benefits of increased focus and reduced manipulation, which reinforces the new behavioral patterns and makes them more sustainable. The fourth phase involves optimization, refining the ability to distinguish between situations where others' opinions matter instrumentally for achieving objectives and those where they represent mere psychological distractions. This phase involves developing sophisticated judgment about when to be responsive to stakeholder concerns and when to ignore them completely. The final phase involves institutionalization, creating organizational systems and cultures that support and reinforce the leader's transformed approach. This might involve changing hiring criteria to prioritize competence over agreeableness, establishing performance metrics that focus on results rather than process, or designing governance structures that enable quick decision-making without extensive consultation. Throughout this transformation process, the leader must guard against overcorrection, the tendency to become unnecessarily antagonistic or dismissive of all feedback and input from others. The goal is not to become indifferent to others' perspectives, but to become psychologically independent of their approval. Effective leaders who complete this transformation typically become better listeners and more collaborative decision-makers because they can evaluate others' input based on its merit rather than on its implications for their relationships. The paradox at the heart of Machiavelli's warning is that leaders become strongest when they stop trying to avoid their own destruction. The leader who accepts that he cannot please everyone, who acknowledges that effective action will inevitably create enemies, who prepares himself psychologically for criticism and opposition, discovers that he has eliminated the primary vulnerabilities that opponents seek to exploit. This acceptance creates a form of psychological armor that external enemies cannot penetrate. They can criticize his decisions, question his methods, and attempt to turn stakeholders against him, but they cannot touch the core of his authority because it no longer depends on their approval or that of anyone else. The leader has destroyed his weak self, the part that needed to be liked and accepted, and, in doing so, has created something that others cannot destroy. The implications of this transformation extend far beyond individual leadership effectiveness to broader questions about organizational culture and societal governance. Organizations led by psychologically independent leaders tend to develop more honest and direct communication patterns, clearer performance standards, and greater tolerance for necessary conflict. These characteristics often translate into superior performance and adaptation capabilities. However, the transformation also carries risks that must be carefully managed. Leaders who eliminate their approval-seeking tendencies without developing compensating mechanisms for gathering feedback and maintaining stakeholder relationships can become isolated and out of touch with important realities. The goal is psychological independence, not social isolation or intellectual arrogance. The most effective leaders who complete this transformation develop sophisticated networks of advisors and information sources who can provide honest feedback and alternative perspectives without requiring approval or validation in return. They create organizational cultures that encourage dissent and debate while maintaining clear lines of authority and accountability. They also develop refined judgment about when stakeholder concerns reflect important information about changing conditions or emerging problems versus when they represent attempts at manipulation or resistance to necessary changes. This judgment requires ongoing attention to the substance of criticism and feedback rather than automatic dismissal based on psychological independence. As the modern world becomes increasingly complex and interconnected, the temptations toward excessive agreeableness in leadership continue to intensify. Social media and instant communication create unprecedented opportunities for stakeholders to express dissatisfaction and coordinate opposition to unpopular decisions. The pressure for transparency and inclusion in decision-making processes has made it increasingly difficult for leaders to maintain the psychological distance that enables decisive action. Yet these same pressures make Machiavelli's insights more relevant than ever. In an environment where everyone can be a critic and where every decision faces immediate scrutiny from multiple constituencies, leaders who depend on approval become paralyzed by the impossibility of satisfying all demands simultaneously. Those who have eliminated their psychological dependence on approval gain enormous competitive advantages in their ability to respond quickly to changing conditions and pursue long-term strategies despite short-term criticism. The digital age has also created new mechanisms through which agreeable leaders can be manipulated and controlled. Social media campaigns, coordinated pressure from activist groups, and the amplification of criticism through online networks all represent modern versions of the tactics that Machiavelli observed in Renaissance Italy. Leaders who have not eliminated their approval-seeking tendencies become vulnerable to these new forms of manipulation in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Conversely, leaders who have achieved psychological independence from approval gain new tools for effective action. Digital communication enables rapid coordination with supporters and stakeholders, while data analytics provide unprecedented insights into the actual rather than perceived consequences of different decisions. The leader who can ignore online criticism while leveraging digital tools for legitimate strategic purposes possesses advantages that were unavailable to earlier generations. The evolution of organizational theory and management practice has also created new challenges for leaders seeking to eliminate excessive agreeableness. Contemporary emphasis on participative management, emotional intelligence, and stakeholder engagement, while valuable in many contexts, can become pathological when they prevent necessary decisive action or enable manipulation by those who understand how to exploit collaborative processes. The most effective modern leaders learn to distinguish between genuine collaboration that improves decision-making and pseudo-collaboration that serves primarily to make stakeholders feel included while diluting accountability and slowing response times. They develop skills in managing stakeholder expectations and communications while maintaining their psychological independence and strategic focus. Educational and development systems for leaders also require modification to address the challenges identified in Machiavelli's warning. Traditional leadership development often emphasizes building relationships, managing consensus, and avoiding conflict approaches that can inadvertently strengthen approval-seeking tendencies rather than developing the psychological independence that enables truly effective leadership. More effective development approaches focus on building comfort with necessary conflict, developing skills in strategic decision-making under uncertainty, and creating psychological resilience in the face of criticism and opposition. These approaches recognize that leadership effectiveness often requires the ability to disappoint stakeholders in service of larger objectives and longer-term success. The measurement and evaluation of leadership effectiveness also must evolve to account for these insights. Traditional metrics that emphasize stakeholder satisfaction, employee engagement, and relationship quality, while important, can become counterproductive when they incentivize excessive agreeableness rather than effective action. More sophisticated evaluation frameworks consider both short-term stakeholder reactions and longer-term organizational performance, recognizing that the most effective leaders often experience temporary decreases in popularity while implementing necessary changes. The implications extend to questions of succession planning and leadership selection. Organizations that prioritize candidates' likability and consensus-building skills over their ability to make hard decisions and tolerate criticism often select leaders who will struggle with the most challenging aspects of their roles. More effective selection processes assess candidates' psychological independence and their track records of making difficult but necessary decisions despite stakeholder opposition. Machiavelli's warning ultimately points toward a fundamental tension in human nature between our desire to be liked and our capacity for effective action in complex environments. The resolution of this tension requires conscious choice and sustained effort to develop psychological independence from others' approval while maintaining intellectual openness to their insights and perspectives. The leader who successfully navigates this challenge discovers that destroying his weak, approval-seeking self creates space for the emergence of more authentic and effective leadership capabilities. He becomes someone who can be trusted to act according to consistent principles rather than fluctuating political pressures, someone who can make difficult decisions when necessary while maintaining the strategic relationships that enable sustained success. This transformation represents not the abandonment of human connection and empathy, but their redirection toward more productive ends. The leader who no longer needs approval from everyone can develop deeper and more meaningful relationships with those who share his objectives and values. He can invest his emotional energy in building effective teams and organizations rather than managing the impressions and reactions of every stakeholder group. The journey from approval seeking to psychological independence is neither easy nor automatic. It requires confronting deeply held beliefs about the nature of relationships and success, tolerating discomfort and criticism while building new behavioral patterns, and maintaining commitment to the transformation despite setbacks and opposition. Yet for those who complete this journey, the rewards include not only enhanced effectiveness but also the particular form of freedom that comes from being indestructible by others because one has already destroyed everything within oneself that could be used as a weapon against one's authentic purposes and values. In this sense, Machiavelli's warning reveals itself as a pathway to liberation rather than mere tactical advice. The leader who heeds this warning and undertakes the difficult work of self-transformation gains not only competitive advantage but also the deeper satisfaction that comes from living and leading according to one's genuine convictions rather than others' expectations. He becomes, in the truest sense, his own man answerable to his principles and objectives rather than to the shifting opinions and demands of those around him. This liberation enables the highest forms of service and contribution, as the leader can focus entirely on what will best serve his organization, his people, and his mission rather than on maintaining his own comfort and security. Paradoxically, by caring less about being liked, he becomes worthy of the deepest forms of respect and loyalty. By accepting the possibility of his own destruction, he creates something that cannot be destroyed by any external force. The man who destroys his weak self, the part that needs constant approval and validation, discovers that what remains is indeed indestructible, not because it is hidden or protected, but because it no longer depends on anything outside itself for its fundamental worth and direction. This is the ultimate wisdom embedded in Machiavelli's warning, that true strength comes not from building defenses against external threats, but from eliminating internal vulnerabilities that give those threats their power. In an age of unprecedented connectivity and stakeholder complexity, this wisdom becomes not merely useful but essential for anyone who seeks to lead effectively and create lasting value. The leaders who will thrive in the coming decades will be those who understand that being agreeable and being effective are often mutually exclusive, and who choose effectiveness while maintaining their fundamental humanity and commitment to serving purposes larger than themselves. The document before you represents an exploration of these themes through the lens of historical analysis, psychological insight, and practical application. Its purpose is not to advocate for callousness or indifference to human welfare, but to clarify the distinction between genuine care for others' well-being and the psychological neediness that masquerades as compassion while undermining the very effectiveness that enables true service. Machiavelli's warning echoes across the centuries because it addresses fundamental aspects of human nature that remain constant despite technological and social changes. The specific tactics and techniques of manipulation may evolve, but the underlying dynamics of power, approval, and psychological vulnerability remain remarkably consistent. The leader who understands and applies these insights gains not only practical advantages but also the clarity and freedom that come from seeing human relationships and organizational dynamics as they actually are rather than as we might prefer them to be. This clarity enables more authentic and, ultimately more satisfying forms of leadership and human connection. When interactions are based on genuine mutual benefit and shared objectives rather than on psychological need and manipulation, they become more honest, productive, and sustainable. The leader who has eliminated his approval-seeking tendencies can engage with others from a position of strength and independence that paradoxically makes him more trustworthy and valuable as an ally and partner. The transformation described in this document represents a form of practical wisdom that has been recognized by effective leaders throughout history, even when they lack the psychological frameworks to articulate it clearly. Today's leaders have access to unprecedented insights into human motivation and behavior, creating opportunities to undertake this transformation more systematically and completely than previous generations could achieve. The question facing contemporary leaders is whether they will use these insights to become more effective manipulators of others' approval-seeking tendencies, or whether they will apply them to their own development in ways that eliminate such vulnerabilities and create more authentic and sustainable forms of authority. The answer to this question will determine not only their individual effectiveness but also the health and productivity of the organizations and societies they lead. Machiavelli's warning, properly understood, points toward a more honest and ultimately more humane form of leadership, one that serves genuine human needs and aspirations rather than the psychological neediness that so often masquerades as care and compassion. The leader who destroys his weak self in service of this vision creates something of enduring value that external forces cannot touch or corrupt. This is the true promise embedded in Machiavelli's insight, that by accepting and working through the difficult realities of human nature and organizational dynamics, leaders can transcend the limitations that constrain most human interactions and create forms of authority and influence that serve the highest human purposes while remaining grounded in practical effectiveness and psychological truth.